In 1880, Las Vegas, New Mexico was one of the fastest-growing cities in the American West. 6 trains per day stopped at the station, bringing merchants, adventurers, and dreamers in search of fortune. But behind the prosperous facade, something sinister was happening. Men who swore to protect the law became its greatest violators. Symbols of authority transformed into instruments of terror. And at the center of this corruption was a man whose name should have been forgotten by history: John Joshua Webb. This is one of the most disturbing stories I've ever investigated about how absolute power can completely corrupt the human soul. A story where the line between protector and hunter completely disappeared, where greed transformed guardians into demons, and where blood-stained gold bought silences that lasted decades. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And if this is your first time on the channel, subscribe so you don't miss our investigations. Because what you're going to discover today will leave you questioning who we can really trust. John Joshua Webb was born on February 14, 1847 in Keokuk County, Iowa, into a family marked by restlessness and mixed blood. He was the 7th of 12 children of William Webb Jr. and Innocent Blue Brown Webb, a name that carried dark secrets buried in the American plains. Innocent Blue Brown wasn't just a peculiar name. Fragments of record suggest she carried Native American heritage, a lineage that decades later would gain macabre significance when Webb began demonstrating an icy indifference to violence and death. William Webb Jr. suffered from a curse that neighbors called wanderlust, a sickly need for movement that prevented him from putting down roots. The family migrated constantly like cursed nomads from Iowa to Illinois in the 1860s, then to Nebraska in 1862, briefly settling in Weeping Water before departing for Oskaloosa, Kansas, and finally to Osage City, Kansas. It was in Osage City that William and Innocent finally found rest, not in life but in death. Both were buried in that arid land, as if the soil had finally claimed their restless souls. But the Webb family curse didn't die with them. This nomadic existence left deep scars on all 12 Webb children, but especially on John Joshua. He developed a disturbing ability to quickly adapt to new environments, to read people and situations with calculating precision, and to never form lasting emotional bonds. It was as if his soul was made of desert sand, always moving, never settling. In 1871, at age 24, Webb departed alone for the West, leaving behind his parents' graves and the ghosts of a childhood marked by constant change. He first worked as a buffalo hunter, providing meat for railroad construction crews. It was brutal work that required not only skill with weapons, but a capacity to kill en masse without hesitation. Witnesses of the era reported that Webb could bring down dozens of buffalo in a single hunt, always with precise shots to the head. But what disturbed his companions wasn't his efficiency, it was the expression on his face while killing. There was no satisfaction, anger, or even concentration. There was only a glacial void, as if he were performing a household chore. A veteran hunter named Tom Buffalo Morrison would later describe Webb as a man who killed like other men breathed. Natural, effortless, thoughtless. It was a talent that would serve Webb well in the dark years to come. In January 1870, Webb joined a U.S. government surveying team. The project began at the Neo River, Kansas, and extended through dangerous territory, Cheyenne and Ca tribal lands near Johns Creek, crossing the Arkansas River into Choctaw Territory in Oklahoma, and continuing through Chaysaw and Seol lands. It was work that placed small groups of men in hostile territories for months, depending only on their weapons and instincts to survive. Webb thrived in this environment of constant danger. His companions noted that he seemed genuinely comfortable with the threat of violent death, as if it were his natural element. The project ended in Arkansas City in June 1871. But Webb had proven something crucial to himself during those months. He didn't just survive in dangerous situations, he dominated them, and more disturbingly, he seemed to feed off them. In the summer of 1871, Webb headed west, attracted by rumors of gold in the former lands of Lucian Maxwell near Cimarron, New Mexico. Maxwell had built an empire based on a land grant of almost unimaginable proportions, and his gold mines at Baldy Mountain were legendary. Lucian Maxwell was a man who had transformed land into gold through a combination of vision, brutality, and luck. When he recognized the gold resources on his property, he sought a strategic approach. The gold deposits around Baldy Mountain led him to proposed selling his land to the U.S. government for a Ute reservation, a proposal that was rejected. Complications arose in the fall of 1866 when a Ute member traded what Captain Moore identified as copper ore at Fort Union. This stimulated negotiations and led to the discovery of copper and gold in the area. In the spring of 1867, miners invaded the Moreno Valley like a plague of locusts, leading Maxwell to charge trespasser fees and invest in infrastructure. Maxwell built a 40-mile ditch for placer mining and toll roads. A stagecoach route opened in the spring of 1868, connecting Elizabethtown to Cimarron, then extending to Ta and Santa Fe. It was an empire built on gold and blood. Maxwell's wealth grew exponentially, feeding rumors that became legends. They said he had gold toys made for his children, rocking horses, dolls, toy soldiers, all carved from pure gold. He kept $30,000 in cash at home, an amount that could buy an entire town. Virginia City emerged on his land like a poisonous mushroom, and in 14 months, Maxwell had accumulated 550 lbs of gold, valued at nearly $175,000. It was wealth that attracted not only honest miners, but also human hunters of every kind. After selling his land grant for $600,000, equivalent to $13.5 million today, and his property in Cimarron for $125,000. Music. Maxwell invested $150,000 in government bonds and $250,000 in the Texas Pacific Railroad, leading to financial losses that would eventually ruin him. Webb possibly established a claim at Willow Creek during this period of gold and chaos. According to local rumors, he also ran a saloon in Elizabethtown, a town that had sprouted from the earth like a malignant tumor, fed by greed and watered with blood. But what exactly Webb found in those mines remains a mystery wrapped in whispers and dark legends. What we know is that when he left the territory, he had enough money to establish himself comfortably anywhere he chose. And more importantly, he had learned valuable lessons about how to extract wealth from weaker men. The Fairfax County War was beginning to ferment in March 1873, a conflict that would last until 1888 and leave hundreds dead scattered across the mountains of New Mexico. A protective meeting on March 30, 1873, initiated the war, which would become one of the bloodiest land disputes in American history. Webb departed before the violence exploded completely, but he took with him valuable lessons about how men with guns could control entire territories through fear. He had seen how the law could be bought, how justice could be sold, and how organized violence could be more profitable than any gold mine. Some veterans of the region whispered decades later that Webb had found more than gold in those cursed mines. They said he had discovered something about himself, a capacity to take what he wanted from weaker men, using violence or the threat of violence without feeling remorse or hesitation. When he finally arrived in Dodge City, Kansas, Webb was no longer the restless young man who had left Iowa. He was an experienced hunter who had learned to disguise his nature behind a facade of respectability. And Dodge City, with its reputation for violence and lawlessness, was the perfect place for a man like him to prosper. Dodge City in 1875 was a university of violence disguised as a frontier town. Located along the Aix, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, it served first as a shipping center for buffalo hides and later as the terminus for cattle drives from Texas. This attracted frequently turbulent visitors and gave the city a reputation for violence that was only partially exaggerated. The 1875 Ford County Census listed J.J. Webb as a 28-year-old teamster, But this simple description concealed the complex network of activities he had begun to develop. Webb quickly established himself as a respected member of the Dodge City community, but those who knew him well noticed something unsettling about his social ascent. He had a supernatural ability to be in the right place at the right time, to know information that others didn't have, and to form alliances with powerful men with a speed that seemed almost magical. But behind this facade of success, Webb was carefully studying how power worked in a frontier town. It was in Dodge City that Webb met the figures who would become central to his transformation. Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Doc Holliday, and eventually Dave Rudab. Each of these men would teach Webb different lessons about violence, power, and survival. Charlie Bassett, the first Ford County sheriff elected in 1873, quickly recognized Webb's value. Bassett worked with several known lawmen, including Wyatt Earp and the Masterson brothers, Edward Ed and Bartholomew Bat. Ed served as town marshal of Dodge City, while Bat was Bassett's under-sheriff. In September 1877, Webb participated in his first major pursuit when he accompanied Sheriff Bassett and Bat Masterson to Lake Kansas in search of Sam Bass's gang. Bass and his men had robbed a Union Pacific train at Big Springs, Nebraska, taking $60,000, an astronomical sum that could buy an entire ranch or set a man up for life. The pursuit was fruitless, but Webb learned valuable lessons watching how experienced lawmen operated. He noticed how they gathered information through networks of informants, how they intimidated witnesses with cold stares and veiled threats, and how the line between legal and illegal methods was frequently blurred when large sums of money were involved. Sam Bass continued to escape lawmen for almost another year, becoming a living legend that mocked authority. He was finally killed on July 21, 1878 after an attempted bank robbery in Round Rock, Texas, but not before Webb had memorized every detail of Bass's tactics, studying them like a dedicated student studies a master. In January 1878, Bat Masterson had become the new Ford County sheriff. On January 29, he deputized Webb along with two other men, Kinch Riley and Dave Prairie Dog Marrero, to help him track 6 outlaws who had robbed a westbound train at Kinsley, Kansas, 2 days earlier. The gang was part of a more complex criminal organization that had evolved over the years. In 1876, Dave Rudab had joined Dan Dement and Michael Rohr to form a gang called the Trio in Texas. It was a simple name for a group that would become synonymous with terror on the plains. In November 1877, the trio robbed men at a railroad construction camp, leading Deputy U.S. Marshal Wyatt Earp to pursue them. Wyatt and his deputies tracked the trio from Arkansas to Fort Griffin, Texas, where he discovered they had been seen at Shanzy's Saloon, also known as the Beehive, from the proprietor, John Shanzy. Wyatt learned that the trio regularly played cards with Doc Holliday, known for his disdain for lawmen. Wyatt was surprised by Doc's cordiality when they met, and the two would become lifelong friends, a friendship that, would be sealed in blood and violence. Doc informed Wyatt that the trio had returned to Kansas, leading Wyatt to send a telegram to Bat Masterson about Rudabor's whereabouts in Kinsley, Kansas. It was a communication network that connected lawmen across hundreds of miles, but also connected criminals who knew how to exploit these same networks. In 1878, Edgar West, J.D. Green, and Tom Gott joined the trio Rudabor and Rock, which subsequently became known as the R&R Gang. The gang's first train robbery was on January 27th near Kinsley, Kansas, which ended in failure. After the failed attempt, the gang split up to avoid arrest. When Masterson's posse caught up with the criminals, Rudabar tried to draw his gun, but Webb detained him and forced his surrender. It was at this moment that something sinister happened between the two men, a connection that would change the course of their lives. Instead of simply arresting Rudabar, Webb spent time talking with him during transport. Witnesses reported that the two men seemed to be negotiating something, whispering to each other in a way that made other posse members feel uncomfortable. It was as if they were speaking a language that only hunters understood. The result was that Rutherford agreed to betray his accomplices in exchange for lenient treatment. Rutherford and West were arrested and later betrayed their gang companions, leading to their arrest and imprisonment. But Dirty Dave was soon released, supposedly for having promised to go straight. The truth was that Webb had recognized in Rutherford a kindred spirit, another hunter who understood that survival depended on always being one step ahead of the law. And Rutherford had recognized in Webb something equally valuable, a lawman who could be corrupted, a man with authority who thought like a criminal. In September 1878, exaggerated reports of Cheyenne attacks led the government to send a large shipment of firearms to Dodge City to help residents defend themselves. Cheyenne Chief Dull Knife and his band had fled their reservation in Oklahoma and were heading for their homeland in the Black Hills. Exaggerated reports of deaths and robberies committed by the Cheyenne on their journey began circulating in Dodge City. Most soldiers from nearby Fort Dodge were sent to capture the Indians, leaving only about 19 troops to protect the area. Unnecessarily terrified for their lives, Dodge City citizens telegraphed the governor requesting arms and ammunition. The weapons were received within days, and Lieutenant Colonel William Henry Lewis, commander of Fort Dodge, selected J.J. Webb, A.J. Anthony, Bill Tillman, Robert Wright, and other experienced plainsmen to patrol the area. Webb and the other men soon brought news that about 200 warriors were in the area, and rumors of their acts continued to grow with headlines screaming, "No child or woman in Kansas or Nebraska is safe." It was hysteria, fed by fear and amplified by sensationalist press. But Webb had learned something important during this crisis. Fear could be a powerful tool to manipulate both authorities and ordinary citizens. He observed how exaggerated reports could justify extraordinary actions, how weapons could be distributed without question, and how panic could be used to consolidate power. Dull Knife's band only wanted to return to their ancestral land and soon withdrew from the area, allowing things to return to normal. But Webb had added another lesson to his arsenal. Fear was as valuable a currency as gold and much easier to manufacture. Ed Masterson died in the line of duty in April 1878, and Charlie Bassett became town marshal of Dodge City. The June 8, 1878 edition of the Dodge City Times listed Bassett's salary as $100 per month. His assistant, Marshal Wyatt Earp, earned $75, and J.J. Webb was listed as special police with a salary of $77,750. The same newspaper had an advertisement for J.H. Holliday. James Henry Doc Holliday had arrived in Dodge City. Wyatt Earp had met Duant C. in Fort Griffin, Texas in Chapter 1877 when he was pursuing a man who had robbed a Santa Fe Railroad construction camp. Earp arrived too late to capture the thief but established a friendship with Holliday, who had played cards with the man the night before. Coincidentally, the man Earp was pursuing was Dave Rutherford. The circle was closing, connecting all the main players in a network of relationships that would eventually become lethal. It was as if fate was weaving a web that would capture them all. In 1879, Webb was selected to serve as a hired gunman for Batmasters during the fight for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad in the Royal Gorge Railroad Wars in Colorado. The conflict arose between the ATNSF and the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad over the railroad route through the gorge. Although the right-of-way was being discussed in court, crews from both railroads were subject to occasional violence from the other side. As violence escalated, both sides began hiring armed men to protect workers and their camps. Webb became part of the group that included strangely Dave Rutherford. It was a surreal situation. A former lawman and a former outlaw working side by side, protecting corporate interests through the threat of violence. As part of the conflict, Webb was briefly appointed a member of the Pueblo, Colorado police force. The Ford County Globe reported in May 1879 that Deputy Sheriff Webb has command of a posse of men employed by the ATNSF Road to protect workers from attacks by hostile forces of the Denver and Rio Grande Road. Webb was quoted saying that they haven't made any fight yet, but the difficulties between the two roads are by no means settled. The Colorado Railroad War ended without significant bloodshed, but many of the Dodge City men apparently decided to relocate for new opportunities. And the opportunity awaiting them in Las Vegas, New Mexico, would be different from anything they had experienced before. It would be their chance to become kings in a kingdom of violence and corruption. Las Vegas, New Mexico in 1879 was what happened when unlimited opportunity met total absence of moral law. Founded in 1835 on the edge of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the city had exploded after the arrival of the Acasin, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad on July 4, 1879. Hundreds of citizens gathered for the arrival of the Iron Horse, including merchants, professionals, desperados, and saloon girls. Overnight, a new city was born on the eastern banks of the Galenas River. First, a settlement of tents, shacks, and makeshift shelters was built. But within a few years, many permanent buildings and a competitive business district had been established. The city became so large it rivaled Denver, Tucson, and El Paso in size. 6 trains per day stopped in Las Vegas, bringing not only legitimate travelers, but also a collection of criminals, conmen, killers, and thieves who would transform the eastern part of the city into completely lawless territory. A letter to the editor of the Dodge City Globe, dated September 30, 1879, signed only as artist, described the city and its famous hot springs. Dodge City is well represented here. N.F. Kelly, Henry Shearer, Dr. Milligan, J.J. Webb, Wyatt Earp, and many others are here. The same correspondent reported in October that Charlie Bassett, Bat Masterson, and half a dozen other Dodgites had relocated there. "We're beginning to think," he wrote, "that all of Dodge is moving west. It was a migration that would bring terrible consequences to Las Vegas." Doc Holliday had arrived first, opening a saloon where gambling never stopped and where men lost more than money. They lost their souls. Webb quickly became Holliday's partner in the establishment, but those who frequented the place began to notice something unsettling about the way Webb observed customers. He memorized who had money, who was alone, who no one would miss. Saloon veterans reported that Webb had the disturbing habit of obsessively cleaning his revolver while talking to prosperous customers, as if sending a silent message about what could happen to those who didn't cooperate. On July 19, 1879, while Webb and Doc were sitting at a card table, a former Army scout and bully named Mike Gordon began shouting loudly at one of the saloon girls, a former girlfriend. She had rejected him while he tried to convince her to leave town with him. Furious, Gordon left the saloon screaming obscenities. When Doc followed the uncontrolled man outside, a shot from Gordon's gun whizzed past him. Calmly drawing his revolver, Doc fired once, leaving Gordon in the dusty street. Gordon died the next day, his blood mixing with the dust of Las Vegas. Webb testified in favor of Holliday at the trial, ensuring his AQW acquittal. As thanks, Doc presented Webb with an engraved pocket watch. "To my partner and friend, John Joshua Webb, July 4, 1879, Las Vegas, NM. But local residents whispered that there was something more sinister about that gift. They said the watch didn't just mark the hours, it marked the time remaining for the victims Webb chose. Decades later, when the watch was auctioned, it reached the price of $30,000, an amount that reflected not only its historical value, but the dark legend that surrounded it. When word spread that Doc would be arrested for the murder, he fled to Dodge City. But Webb remained, and his presence in Las Vegas began to attract other dark elements like flies drawn to rotting meat. In 1880, Webb accepted the position of City Marshal of Las Vegas. It was the perfect position for a man with his dark ambitions. Now he had not only the power to kill, but the legal authority to do so. It was like giving a hunting license to a wolf. It was then that he, officially joined what became known as the Dodge City Gang, led by Justice of the Peace Hyman Neal, known by the sinister nickname Hoodoo Brown. The gang was firmly controlled by a criminal cartel determined to mock the law and transform Las Vegas into their personal kingdom. The Dodge City Gang consisted of men formerly from Dodge City, each occupying a position of authority that gave them legal power to commit crimes. Hyman Hoodoo Brown. Neal served as Justice of the Peace and Coroner. City Marshal Joe Carson controlled the municipal police. Deputy U.S. Marshal Mysterious Dave Mather had federal authority, and John Joshua Webb, as a police officer, had the power to arrest and kill. But the gang also included several gunmen and outlaws who did the dirty work. Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, William P. Slapjack, Bill Nicholson, John Tut, Jack Pierce, Sem K, Frank Cady, Jordan L. Webb, no relation to JJ, and several other tough cases whose nicknames reflected their violent nature. Tom Pickett served as chief of merchant police, adding another layer of official authority to the criminal operation. It was a perfect system of corruption. While Rudabaugh, Jordan Webb, Cady Nicholson, Pierce, and the rest committed acts of robbery, Neal, Mather, Carson, and J.J. Webb in their official capacities helped cover the outlaws' tracks. For 2 years, members of the Dodge City Gang participated in various stagecoach and train robberies and organized cattle rustling on an industrial scale. They were suspected of being responsible for multiple murders and lynchings, crimes that were never officially investigated because the investigators were the criminals themselves. Brown wasn't Justice of the Peace. He was also the coroner, which meant he determined the official causes of death. Dave Mather was Deputy U.S. Marshal, giving him authority to arrest anyone in federal territory. Webb was the Las Vegas City Marshal with power to enforce municipal law. They weren't just criminals disguised as lawmen. They were something much worse. They were hunters who had discovered that the law could be a more effective weapon than any revolver. They had transformed the entire justice system into a machine of extortion and murder where they were simultaneously the criminals, investigators, judges, and executioners. The gang operated with an arrogance that shocked even the hardened criminals who frequented Las Vegas. They didn't just commit crimes, they committed them openly, knowing they controlled the entire justice system that should punish them. It was as if they had created their own kingdom where they were simultaneously kings and executioners. Residents reported seeing Webb walking the streets at night, stopping in front of prosperous merchants' houses, studying them like a wolf studies a flock. Others whispered about nighttime meetings where the gang planned their next targets, dividing territories like generals planning a military campaign. But the Dodge City Gang's arrogance was about to meet its limit, and when that happened, blood would flow through the dusty streets of Las Vegas like a red river of retribution. If you're enjoying this investigation, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming, because what happened on March 2, 1880 will leave you speechless. Michael Kellaher was an Irish freighter who made a fatal mistake. He passed through Las Vegas carrying $1,000. Music. This was a death sentence signed in golden ink. Keller worked as a freighter, transporting goods between territory towns. He was a hard-working man who had accumulated his savings over years of honest work, planning to use the money to establish his own transportation business. But in Las Vegas, honest prosperity was seen as weakness by members of the Dodge City Gang. The gang's informant network was extensive and efficient. Bartenders, prostitutes, gamblers, stable owners, all reported to the gang about who had money and who could be an easy victim. It was a surveillance system that would make any modern criminal organization envious. On the morning of March 2, 1880, Hoodoo Brown received information about Keller's money, not through legitimate police investigation, but through this sinister network that kept Las Vegas under constant observation. The information ached Brown like blood, reaching a hunter's heart. Brown summoned Webb to a private meeting in his office. What was said in that encounter was never officially recorded, but witnesses reported seeing Webb leave Brown's office with an expression they described as hungry. His eyes had acquired a gleam that city veterans had learned to fear, the gleam of a hunter who had chosen his next victim. The plan was simple and brutal. Webb would confront Kellaher about illegally carrying a weapon, a technical violation of municipal law. When Kellaher resisted, and Brown was certain he would resist because honest men always resist injustice, Webb would have legal justification to kill him. The money would be confiscated as evidence and then discreetly divided among gang members. In the early hours of March 2nd, Kellaher entered the Goodlet and Robert Saloon, accompanied by William Brickley and another man. The saloon was owned by a member of the Dodge City Gang, controlled territory where they could operate without interference from hostile witnesses. The choice of timing wasn't coincidental. In the early morning hours, only the most intoxicated and least reliable customers would be present as witnesses. It was a time when death could happen without many questions, when blood could be washed away before respectable people woke up. Webb and another officer entered through the back door like hunters surrounding their prey. Kellaher was armed with a pistol in his holster, which was technically illegal under Las Vegas municipal ordinances, but in a city where half the men went armed, the law was only enforced when it served the gang's interests. "Hand over your weapon," Webb ordered, but his voice carried something beyond legal authority. There was a poorly disguised anxiety, a hunger that made Brickley and Kellaher's other companion instinctively back away. It was the voice of a man about to commit murder and could barely contain his excitement. Kellaher, perhaps sensing he was being hunted, refused. "I won't be disarmed. Anything goes," he replied, moving his hand to his revolver. It was exactly the reaction Webb was expecting, the justification he needed to do what he had already decided to do. What happened next was described by witnesses as execution, not self-defense. Webb drew with supernatural speed and fired 3 times in rapid succession. 2 bullets to the chest, 1 to the head. Kellaher died before his body hit the dirty saloon floor, his blood spreading like a red pool of accusation. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the death, it was what came after. Webb searched Kellaher's still warm body in front of everyone present, removing 1,000 audis in cash. There was no attempt to disguise the robbery or follow proper legal procedures. It was as if he wanted everyone to know that the law in Las Vegas had a price, and that price was paid in blood. The Las Vegas Daily Optic reported the events in sanitized form, but the discrepancies were obvious to anyone paying attention. Kellaher supposedly carried $1,900, but only $1,090 were officially recorded. The remaining $810 had simply disappeared. Hoodoo Brown, as coroner, conducted the inquest into Kellaher's death. As justice of the peace, he presided over the hearing. The verdict was predictable, justifiable, death in the line of duty, but there was a disturbing discrepancy in the numbers that not even Brown could completely hide. The difference of $810 had probably been divided between Brown and Webb before the body even cooled. It was such a brazen theft that even hardened criminals were shocked by the audacity. But something had changed in the city after Kellaher's murder. Even the most experienced criminals began whispering that Webb had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. He was no longer a corrupt lawman. He was something much more dangerous. He was a killer who had discovered that a badge could be a license to kill anyone who possessed something he wanted. Residents reported seeing Webb walking the streets at night after the murder, stopping in front of prosperous merchants' houses, studying them like a wolf studies a flock. They said he had developed the habit of obsessively cleaning his revolver while talking to people, as if sending a silent message about what could happen to those who possessed wealth. Others whispered that Webb had begun using Doc Holliday's watch in a macabre way, timing how much time his potential victims had before he decided it was time to enforce the law. It was as if time had become a weapon in his hands. Keller's death wasn't an isolated crime. It was the moment when John Joshua Webb stopped pretending to be a lawman and revealed what he really was, a killer with a badge, a hunter who had found the perfect camouflage for his bloodthirsty nature. And in Las Vegas, where the law was just a suggestion and justice was sold to the highest bidder, Webb had found his personal paradise. But even in paradise, there are serpents, and the serpent was about to bite its own tail. Michael Keller's execution was the mistake that destroyed the Dodge City gang, not because it was particularly brutal. They had committed worse crimes in the shadows of Las Vegas, but because it was too brazen, too public, too greedy. Even in a city accustomed to violence, there were limits to what people would tolerate. Charles Blanchard, the probate judge, refused to accept the official version of events. When Hoodoo Brown tried to appoint himself administrator of Keller's estate, a maneuver that would give him legal control over all the dead man's money, Blanchard discovered discrepancies that couldn't be ignored or explained. The financial inconsistencies were glaring. Brown had clearly pocketed the missing $800 before the body even cooled. It was such flagrant theft that even hardened criminals were shocked by the audacity. Blanchard was an honest man in a corrupt city, and he had seen enough. He requested that the grand jury in West Las Vegas investigate the entire Dodge City gang operation. What they discovered was an empire of corruption that extended throughout the territory like a poisonous spiderweb. The gang didn't just rob and kill. They had transformed the entire legal system into a machine of extortion and murder. Brown as coroner determined the causes of death, always concluding they were justifiable when gang members were involved. As justice of the peace, he judged cases, ensuring his accomplices were never convicted. Mather, as deputy U.S. Marshal, arrested whoever they wanted, eliminated. Webb, as city marshal, executed whoever they chose. Tom Pickett, as chief of merchant police, intimidated merchants into paying protection fees. It was a perfect system of legalized hunting that had transformed Las Vegas into a kingdom of terror. The grand jury discovered evidence of at least a dozen unsolved murders, all involving victims who possessed money or valuable property. They found records of confiscations that never reached official coffers. They found witnesses who had been intimidated into silence or who had simply disappeared into the desert. On March 5, 1880, warrants were issued. Webb was charged with first-degree murder. Brown was charged with complicity and embezzlement, but when deputies arrived to arrest Brown, he had vanished like smoke in the desert wind. Hoodoo Brown was never seen in Las Vegas again. Some said he had fled to Mexico with pockets full of stolen gold. Others whispered that Webb had killed him to ensure his silence, burying him somewhere in the desert where coyotes would clean the bones. The truth died with him, but his absence left Webb completely exposed. Webb was arrested and tried quickly. For the first time in his life, he faced real consequences for his actions. The jury, composed of citizens fed up with the gang's tyranny, convicted him without hesitation. The sentence was death by hanging. But Webb wasn't a man who accepted defeat easily. Even in prison, he maintained the same cold arrogance that characterized him. Guards reported that he spent hours polishing his marshal's badge, as if it were a talisman that could still save him from the gallows. Other prisoners whispered that Webb had made a pact with the devil during his days as marshal, and that the badge was the symbol of that pact. They said that as long as he kept it, death couldn't touch him. It was superstition, but in a land where violence was as common as sunset, superstitions had power. On April 30, 1880, Dave Rudabor and John Allen attempted to free Webb in a poorly planned operation that ended in tragedy. They invaded the prison, pulled a gun on the jailer, and demanded the keys. A struggle followed in which jailer Antonio Leno Valdez was shot and killed while defending his prisoner. Valdez was a popular man in the local Mexican community, respected for his honesty and courage. His death nearly caused a lynching that would have ended with Webb hanging from a tree. The Dodge City Globe wrote that the noise of the shot having brought all the guards to the scene, the two men became frightened and departed before accomplishing their mission. Not only had the sloppy attempt to free Webb failed, but Webb was in even greater danger. Enraged crowds gathered in front of the prison, demanding that Webb be turned over to them for popular justice. The Mexican community in particular wanted revenge for Valdez's death. Only a heavy armed guard prevented Webb from being dragged from his cell and hanged in the street like a rabid dog. Webb's sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment by New Mexico Governor Lew Wallace, the same man who would later write Ben-Hur. But Webb knew this was just a postponement. In Las Vegas, he had become the symbol of everything wrong with the Wild West. Rutherford soon fled Las Vegas with another Dodge City gang member joining Billy the K. Wyatt and his gang. But fate caught up with Rutherford on December 23, 1880, when he and Billy, the Kid, were captured by Pat Garrett at a place called Stinking Springs. Pat Garrett had been elected as the new Lincoln County Sheriff on November 2, 1880, with a convincing victory of 320 to 179 votes over his opponent, Sheriff Kymel. Although he couldn't take office until January 1881, he immediately began working with Kimbrell's support, who deputized him. Garrett was also appointed Deputy U.S. Marshal, allowing him to travel across states to execute his duties thanks to the efforts of Secret Service agent Azariah Wild. Despite the challenges and dangers involved in capturing Billy the Kid and other alleged counterfeits like Billy Wilson, Garrett took on the task with deadly seriousness. Pat had hired Barney Mason as an informant. Barney had informed Pat that the group of men was at Dan Dietry's ranch, located about 80 mi west of Las Vegas at Bosa Grande. Consequently, the POSE made the necessary preparations and raided the ranch. Although the Kid and the counterfeits weren't present, J.J. Webb was captured and charged with murder and escaped from federal custody. George Davis was also arrested for horse theft. Garrett turned custody of the prisoners over to the San Miguel sheriff in Las Vegas. Billy the Kid would be sent to Lincoln County Jail, where his legend would continue until his death at Garrett's hands. But Rutherford was sent back to Las Vegas to face trial for the murder of Antonio Leno Valdez. In December, Rutherford had been sentenced to death for Valdez's murder, and Webb's sentence had been commuted to life imprisonment. But both men knew this was just the beginning of their troubles. And men like John Joshua Webb and Dave Rutherford didn't accept cages. The Las Vegas prison wasn't built to contain men like Webb and Rutherford. It was a simple structure of adobe and stone designed for drunks and petty criminals, not experienced hunters who had spent years studying the weaknesses of the legal system. Webb and Rutherford, now reunited in the same cell, began planning not just an escape, but a final declaration that men like them couldn't be contained by laws made by lesser men. It was a matter of pride as much as survival. On September 19, 1881, they made their first serious attempt. Along with Thomas Duffy and H.S. Wilson, they tried to shoot their way out of prison. Somehow, the prisoners had managed to smuggle a weapon into the prison and, forcing the locks of their cells, attacked the guards in a desperate attempt to escape. The attempt failed disastrously. The Las Vegas Gazette described the guards' defense as heroic. Duffy was killed in the shootout, his blood staining the prison stone floor as a warning to other prisoners. The survivors were forced back into their cells at gunpoint. Webb was one of 4 men in the cell, but denied participating in the escape attempt. It was an obvious lie, but he maintained it with the same coldness that had characterized all his crimes. But Webb had learned something important. Direct violence wouldn't work against prepared and alert guards. He needed to be more subtle, more patient. Like a true hunter, he began studying the prison as he had studied his victims, looking for weaknesses, memorizing routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity. For 2 months, Webb and Rutherford worked methodically. Using telegraph wires smuggled into the prison, probably by sympathizers or paid accomplices, they began loosening the stones in the wall. They worked only at night when the guards slept, removing 1 stone at a time with supernatural patience. Telegraph wire was the perfect tool, strong enough to loosen mortar, small enough to hide, and common enough not to arouse suspicion if found. Webb had learned about telegraph wire during his days as a surveyor, and now this knowledge would become his key to freedom. Guards noticed that Webb had become strangely calm during this period, and no longer the arrogant man who obsessively polished his badge. Now he was silent, contemplative, almost meditative. It was as if he was channeling all his energy toward a single goal. Webb had deliberately lost weight during the weeks before the escape, preparing his body to pass through an opening that would be impossible for a normal-sized man. Rutherford did the same, and both men became shadows of their former selves, skeletons covered in skin and determination. They secretly exercised in their cells, practicing contortions that would allow them to pass through impossible spaces. It was physical and mental preparation that demonstrated the level of planning they had invested in their escape. On the night of December 7, 1881, 7 prisoners escaped through a hole measuring 7 by 19 in the prison wall. It was an opening so small it seemed physically impossible for adult men to pass through. But Webb and Rutherford had prepared like athletes preparing for an Olympic competition. Besides Webb and Rutherford, the other fugitives included 5 men whose names were lost to history, but whose crimes were known throughout Las Vegas. It was a collection of killers, thieves, and desperados that represented the worst the West had to offer. The escape was discovered only the next morning when guards made their morning rounds. By the time they realized what had happened, the fugitives already had hours of advantage in the vast and unforgiving territory of New Mexico. Webb and Rutherford fled together to Texas, then to Mexico. But even among criminals, there were limits to trust. In Mexican territory, where there was no American law to protect or pursue them, they separated forever. Rutherford headed to Tombstone, Arizona, where he joined the cowboys in their war against the brothers. His uncontrolled violence finally caught up with him. He was killed in Mexico in February 1883, decapitated by locals fed up with his crimes. Legend says his head was displayed on a stake in the town's main square as a warning to other outlaws. It was an appropriate end for a man who had lived by violence to die by violence, his head serving as a macabre trophy for those who finally said enough. As for Webb, he simply disappeared. Like a ghost that had haunted the West for too long, he dissolved into the vastness of American territory. For months, there were no news, rumors, or sightings. It was as if the earth had opened and swallowed him. Then, in April 1882, a letter arrived at the Dodge City Times. It was from a man named J.A. Scott, reporting that Webb had settled in Winslow, Arkansas, under the name Samuel King. He worked as a teamster for the railroad, an honest profession for a man who had spent years robbing and killing. Scott's letter was brief but revealing. You may be interested to know that J.J. Webb died here on April 12th of smallpox. He was working under the name Samuel King as a teamster. You can tell his friends of his death. Webb had changed his name, found honest work, and seemed to be trying to rebuild his life away from the shadows of his past. It was an attempt at redemption that could have worked if fate hadn't had other plans. But even this apparent redemption had a dark end. Smallpox was a slow and agonizing death characterized by high fever, excruciating pain, and eruptions that covered the entire body. It was as if the universe was finally collecting its debt for all the crimes he had committed. Some whispered that, even in his final moments, Webb still carried the watch Doc Holliday had given him. The watch that supposedly marked the remaining time of his victims had finally marked his own end. It was a poetic irony that wasn't lost on the few who knew the complete story. Others said he had confessed his crimes on his deathbed, trying to make peace with God before facing final judgment. But if such confessions existed, they died with him on the arid plains of Arkansas, carried away by the wind like dust. Joshua Webb never never had children, never left anything but a trail of blood and terror. His only legacy was a dark legend about how a man can fall so low that even death seems like mercy. Doc Holliday's watch decades later would be sold at auction for $30,000, an amount that reflected not only its historical value, but the macabre legend that surrounded it. It was as if his victim's blood had turned to gold, increasing its value with each story told about its former owner's crimes. John Joshua Webb died more than 140 years ago, but his story continues to echo as a dark warning about what happens when we give absolute power to men without conscience. He wasn't just a criminal, he was something much more dangerous. He was a hunter who discovered that the law could be a more effective weapon than any revolver. A man who transformed a marshal's badge into a license to kill, who used legal authority as camouflage for his darkest instincts. Webb's journey from Iowa to Arkansas was a gradual descent into moral hell. Each stop in his life, the cursed gold mines of New Mexico, the violent streets of Dodge City, the corrupt saloons of Las Vegas, added another layer of darkness to his soul. Born into a family of 12 children marked by native blood and perpetual restlessness, Webb carried in his veins both the coldness of ancient warriors and the corruption of modern civilization. His mother, innocent Blue Brown, had given him a name that would become a cruel irony. There was nothing innocent about the man he would become. Lucian, Maxwell's mines, where Webb possibly found his first gold, were a perfect symbol of his life. Wealth extracted through violence, prosperity built on others' suffering. Maxwell had created gold toys for his children, but Webb would create only nightmares for his victims' families. Las Vegas, New Mexico, eventually recovered from the Dodge City gang's tyranny, but the scars remained. Generations of families carried memories of the terror that men like Webb spread. Michael Kelly's name was remembered not as a prosperous merchant, but as a victim of a corrupt system that transformed lawmen into killers. The real tragedy isn't that Webb became a monster. It's that the system allowed him to operate for so long. How many other Wild West towns harbored similar hunters? How many other lawmen crossed the line between protector and predator? How many other badges became symbols of terror instead of justice? The Dodge City gang wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a system that gave power without accountability, authority without oversight. Hoodoo Brown, Mysterious Dave Mather, Slapjack Bill, Nicholson, Kamsaw, Jack Pierce. All these men found ways to transform the law into a tool of oppression. Webb's story reminds us that corruption isn't just about money or power. It's about the gradual erosion of the human soul. It's about how good men can become demons when they believe they're above the law they swore to defend. Doc Holliday's watch, sold for $30,000 more than a century later, serves as a tangible reminder that some stories never die. They transform into legends, and legends transform into warnings for future generations. And perhaps the most disturbing lesson of all is this. Somewhere in some city, there may be another John Joshua Webb waiting for his chance to transform a badge into a weapon of terror. Because evil never really dies, it just changes form and waits for its next opportunity. The smallpox that killed Webb in Arkansas was an appropriate death for a man who had spread a moral disease wherever he went. Slow, painful, disfiguring. It was as if his body finally reflected the corruption of his soul. But even in death, Webb left a final lesson. That no matter how far a man flees from his crimes, no matter how many names he changes or how many new lives he tries to build, the past always finds a way to collect its debt. What did you think of this investigation? Did you know J.J. Webb's story? Leave a T in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more disturbing stories from the past that still haunt the present.